this looks good. Oh my
God, all right, and now we are moving into our plate of the day. Growing up with white folk. So I am really excited to be talking about this because I think there are certain parallels in my growing up that I could identify with people who grew up around white people. Not because I grew up around white people, the opposite, but because my indulgence of white culture made me stick out in a way that people were like, oh, so like you're basically white. And then I was the white person, even though I'm not a white person. But I've always wondered what it actually felt like to grow up in a community where there were a lot of white people. And so when we sort of teased about this last night, I was like, holy shit, yeah, I didn't even actually realize that about your upbringing. And it then made me realize how little I know in general about your upbringing and your relationship, not only growing up in a white community, but like what that meant for your proximity of Blackness and how people may or may not bring your Blackness into question and digging into that in a very specific way. But I wanted to start off sort of just asking, what is your relationship with your Blackness? Like what is, if you could, whatever that means to you, what is your relationship with your Blackness?
That took me honestly forever to kind of figure out. And it's not even that I have figured it out, to be honest. It's more of just kind of like I'm okay with kind of where it is within my journey of just like being myself, right? Just being authentic to who I am. So just kind of taking in that way. But kind of the road to discovery was just kind of figuring out one, like what does it mean to be Black? Either way, like what is that definition? How do you really find that? And if you kind of feel outside of it, like you don't naturally have that kind of innate definition within you, like how do you find that within yourself? So I feel like the first kind of exploration was through music. That was kind of like the easiest thing, and that was honestly just my connection because I connected to music already naturally as a person. It's how I express myself, it's how I connected to my emotions, it's how I communicated sometimes. Was that way. So I always liked kind of more of the hip hop R&B type of music, so naturally it wasn't anything that was forced. Like I was the person like listening to like my CD player handheld to like Jewel Santana on the bus, right? Like, you know, when everyone else was listening to like, I don't know, Britney Spears was really popular at the time. Avril Lavigne was really popular at the time, in like high school. So that was kind of the way I really expressed myself through music. I remember in elementary school when I was even younger, I ran for like student council secretary. And I ran under the name Jazzy J. And I like I rapped my speech in the cafeteria. And I guess that was another way of like associating myself with Black culture, even though like it wasn't something I was really around. And honestly, still at that point, like didn't know what that really meant. As was I like trying to be Black, or was I like just was that naturally what I wanted to do? So I struggled a really long time trying to figure out what it meant to be Black and how I wanted to relate myself to that or find myself within that culture.
And can you tell us where you grew up? Tell us a little, set the context for us.
So I grew up, I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. If you followed the U.S. election, you may have heard that county come up a lot within, you know, the Pennsylvania numbers. I grew up across the street from a farm that literally grows corn. Suburban area. My elementary school was literally like 2 blocks away from me. My elementary school was maybe like a 10-minute drive away, and my high school was, you know, pretty close too. My high school was very big. I went to Pennsbury High School. My graduating class was like 1,000 people. The prom.
their high school used to like have like this thing on MTV, right? When they used to do like a parade.
Yeah, so if you look up Pennsbury, if you look up like best prom in America, my high school will come up because one, you have so many people. There's at least like close to 1,500, 2,000 people that go to prom. So that's a huge prom. It's always a different theme. There's a huge like 2-hour parade before it. And some of the most iconic like things.
That's what I'm saying. Like on MTV, they had like this special where they were showing the students creating the floats for arriving at their prom.
People have come on helicopters. People have come in like clear, like tanks, like pools, and have like swam and then like changed out of their wetsuit, and they were in full gowns walking the red carpet into, like there was one thing I loved the most that was like a gumball machine. So it was like this gigantic, huge gumball machine, and it just had like balloons in it. And all of the guys were, it was like 4 guys, they were sitting outside of the gumball machine. They got up to the red carpet. They all had a coin. They put the coin in there, and poof, a girl came rolling out of the gumball machine.
What?
And that was like how they got their date. And then after all the girls came out, they had like one big coin that said like Pennsbury High School on it. They put that in, and then all of the balloons came out of the top of the gumball machine.
I think it's safe to say that when we think of high school, well, not high school, because when we think of like our schooling experience, me and Julissa had a lot more Save the Last Dance, and Jessica had a lot more Saved by the Bell.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So like, even if you think of like my music program at my school was huge.
Yes.
Every, like, you had, like, you either had to be in choir or you selected yourself to be in choir, and that was a class. Like, that wasn't just like an like added after school thing. That was a class you took on the regular. And then they had selective choirs, which you could audition for, and those choirs tended to travel and do tours. And then you had the musicals and dramas. There was like 2 musicals a year, 2 dramas a year. We had our own music theory teacher. There were other classes that you could take, like elective classes that you could take just on music alone. So just in high school, I did 2 European tours alone.
Wow.
Tony Auschwitz in France, Czech Republic twice, my junior year and senior year. So it was a huge kind of, they put a lot of money into the arts within my school too.
And is that, and I'm glad you said that they put a lot of money into it, because I was about to say, now, like, so yes, it's a predominantly white community. Is that, so a predominantly white community, would you say that the socioeconomic class is also that, like, is it middle class America? Is it an upper class America? Talk to me a little bit about the finances of the people here.
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit of everything. You definitely have like some lower class because of kind of where the area is. Mostly middle class, and then you do have some like kind of upper middle class. I wouldn't say you had like a lot of rich people. They went to a lot of the kind of local private schools in the area, but kind of the upper middle class people who, you know, like you have like your doctors, your lawyers, maybe even, you know, some people that worked within the government, but not like super high level positions. Like, that was the demographic that went to my school. But it was huge. The school used to have, my district used to have 2 high schools. And then right before my freshman year, actually, they combined the 2 high schools. So I would say those 2 high schools maybe had slightly even different demographics, but then once they combined them, kind of everyone was there.
Gotcha. And so let's get to the nitty gritty of it. So you're a Black girl in this white ass community that is, you know, is semi-affluent, at least, you know, or mostly affluent. What is your experience in the middle of this, being a Black woman in this space? And how did your Blackness come to your awareness being in those spaces?
Yeah. I would say it was mostly through like where I figured out my Blackness kind of came into play was mostly within music, was in choirs, was in performances, because like who was gonna be the lead? What was the lead gonna look like? So those things definitely came into play, and definitely where I felt like, whoa, like I have friends that look like everyone, right? I had Asian friends, I had Black friends, I had white friends, I had Hispanic friends. Like I had a ton of different type of looking friends, but when it came to the stuff that I was actually doing and pursuing within school is, where I all of a sudden felt like a Black girl and not just a girl. So in middle school, I tell the story a lot. Not in middle school, in elementary school in fourth grade, the teacher brought my parents in and the principal, and they were like, Jessica needs to be in special education classes.
Oh.
And so they were like, she stares off into space. She doesn't take her coat off when other kids take her coat off, and she's not that communicative. So my parents were like, okay, well, that doesn't really help us with kind of figuring out why she needs to be in special education classes. So, a whole lot of things. My parents, are amazing and fought for me to stay in the regular classes with my students. That teacher was talked to because we were confused as to why all of a sudden I needed to be out of her class, right? Like why all of a sudden I couldn't be there. So it's not definitive that was necessarily a race thing, but I was definitely being called out for something. And so move forward into kind of music in the sense of like, I would audition just like everyone else, and I would get a solo, and all of a sudden that solo would either be taken and it would be now an ensemble, or it was, oh, actually we're gonna cut this longer solo into half, Jessica's gonna do one part, and then we're gonna have more people do the other part, when that was never originally the case. So that was what happened a lot in elementary school and middle school. In high school, it's where not necessarily the solos within choir, but within the musicals where all of a sudden casts were being split instead of just one cast. And, wanting me to be in it because I was talented, but not knowing where I could visibly be placed because of how I looked and appeared.
And outside of like school, what was the experience of being in that community? Would you say that microaggressions and things like that were something that were very present, or was it one of those things where it was like, yeah, it was obvious that there were a lot more white people than everyone else, but nobody talked about it or cared that was the case?
Yeah, I also think it's a little different too. My siblings, we always called ourselves like we're the Williams kids. We always really felt like an exception to the other Black people within our community. Of course, there were Black people that went to my school, people that we were friends with. We would be accepted different places that a lot of our other Black friends would not. I feel like people felt comfortable with me and my siblings and our family because we were talented. My siblings are very intelligent. So they got a lot of different awards and recognitions just for their intelligence and being smart. And I got a lot of recognition for being talented. So we were an exception to a lot of the rules within my community. So I would say microaggressions in the sense of, yes, I got them, but also seeing how my other friends were definitely treated differently than I was.
I wonder how much, because I know that your father and your mother both were people that went to college, they're both educated. Your father was a fraternity guy.
Mom, yeah.
Your mom was in a sorority. I wonder how much that played into you guys being the exception, or if because they went through these levels of education and training or whatever, if that then affected how they brought you up to then,
where's the influence that makes the difference in the experience?
Yeah, so the influence there is like my dad he's from Detroit, Michigan, and my mom is from Shreveport, Louisiana. Like, my parents grew up in Black communities, fully Black communities. My mom grew up in the hood. She grew up in the ghetto. They ended up going to school together at Fisk University, so the HBCU in Nashville, Tennessee, and that's where they met. They wanted a different life for their kids. They wanted more opportunities, opportunities that they didn't get growing up. So I wouldn't necessarily say that there was like an influence based on their educational background, but definitely an influence based on their values and what they wanted for their kids and kind of a life that they dreamed of having for their kids. I wouldn't even say they had that dream for themselves, to be honest. They had that dream to literally have children so that those children could have a better chance at life. So they left their communities, they left their friends, they left their church, their family, and moved to Pennsylvania, of all states, where they had no community, no friends, no family, just to be able to make sure that their kids grew up in a different neighborhood, in a different kind of education system, and a different demographic than they did.
So, no, I was gonna say I'd be interested how the rest of the family responds to y'all in terms of like how is it the case that you guys are an exception to what the turnout was in the families on either side, or is it just the case that you guys do come from a lineage of folks where a bunch of people did that? So not just your parents, but their siblings, right? And that there's this idea that the Williams family, though not in the same community now, does have the same sort of status, or is it one of those things? I guess the real question I'm asking is it one of those things where it's like y'all are looked at as bougie and different from the family, or is it like, like that is the posture that this family has taken, and so it's not looked at as they think they're better than us, or is it a like, nah, they're with us?
It's a little bit of both, to be honest, because one, my family period are all driven like work. We are a working family, extended family, like everyone across the board just works. Like, just, it's Thanksgiving. We just had like a family Zoom call, and someone just announced that that they weren't at like any kind of family gathering because they had to work, and people were cheering. So they were like, yeah, work, yeah. Don't take off for family holidays.
Wow.
Like, you gotta work, yeah. So that's really where my family comes from. So, my siblings and my parents, we do a lot, and we have succeeded and done a lot. So there is pride from, my extended family with that, of what we're doing, and being very proud of, what I'm doing within my work, what my brother's doing within his work and within his school, what my sister's doing within his work. It's all pretty extraordinary and big things that are happening. But then there is the sense of, we didn't grow up in the same community, right? We grew up in different communities. So me and my siblings at a lot of the holiday parties were kind of in the corner by ourselves, because other than like the, hey, how you doing? How's everything been? There's not much else in common to communicate about, just because we simply grew up differently. So even though my family has done everything they could to give the next generation more opportunities, we just grew up in different places. So that already means we're at a different level, just simply because of where we lived and where we grew up.
I'm interested to hear a little bit about your experience in college, because we went to college together, and our school was a very white school, a predominantly white school.
Sure.
And I feel like we had very unique experiences, you being a Black girl from the suburbs, me being a Latino from the inner city, and then having come into our school. To put into context, I went to college with 6 other inner city minorities, and so it was very, very easy for the Black kids to stick together because there was only so few of us. But Jessica was one of those people that was able to kind of maneuver throughout. So like kind of speak on that, like what's your experiences with that? And
I think that kind of goes back to the first question, right? Of like, where do I see myself within the Black community, and how do I identify myself there? Eventually I came to the point where I was just like, I'm Black, like there's not much else I can do about it. I can't be a certain way, I can't act a certain way, I just have to kind of be who I am. I grew up in the suburbs, yes. I can code switch pretty easily, yes, because that's just how I grew up. I grew up having white friends where all we were listening to were NSYNC and I can't even think of all of
white
the just
music,
but it's amazing because that's music I love too. Like one of my favorite bands in the world is Paramore, and Paramore was my God, it's just good music, right? So that was huge, but that wasn't necessarily something that a lot of the Black community was listening to at the time, right? It was alternative emo rock music that was popular, but it wasn't necessarily like, huge of what the Black community was listening to at that time. So I listened to a lot of different music because I had a lot of different friends and I was accepted in a lot of different areas, and I knew how to act within each different community, but I also knew what I liked. And so by the time I got to college, like I knew I liked being with people that did have a culture, right? That did have an actual true identity. So I connected a lot with the Latinx community and a lot with the LGBTQ community because they had cultures that they could grasp onto. They had history that they could grasp onto. They had a language that they could grasp onto. And that was fascinating to me because I, as a Black person in America, don't really have that. I'm just American. And everything else about it is kind of what I have made myself to be, other than that stamp of color on my face of being Black.
Now, would you say though that you always even like did you always feel safe as a Black person? I ask that because I always feel like growing up in the inner city, one of the things I think about areas like yours stereotypically is like, oh, if I'm a Black person out in these parts, then I'm a target. I'm not safe here, right? Like, oh, if somebody wants to snatch me into the night through the cornfield, this is a great spot for that to happen. And then oftentimes when I am in those spaces, the first thing I instinctually run to is to compromise my Blackness in order to hide and sort of like camouflage as much as possible. And so I wonder, like, did you grow up feeling safe? Like, or was that a thing? Like, would you fear the police, would you say, growing up where you were? Or was that not really a thing?
No, that definitely was not a fear that I've had, to be completely honest. It wasn't necessarily a fear of the police coming to, kind of like harass me or like ask me where I've been coming from. It was more of people, not necessarily cops. It was more people asking me and wondering or looking at me because I'm in an area where I've grown up my entire life, right? Even walking around my neighborhood, like I have to like make sure that like I'm wearing the certain like the right amount of clothes to show that like I'm just taking a stroll around my neighborhood where I've grown up my entire life. Like I'm not an outsider, but I am probably one of maybe 2 or 3 Black people that live within my neighborhood.
Wow.
So there's really not that many. So just to like, see another Black person walking around, you already kind of feel like you have to just make sure that people know that you're not about to run up on them, like you're not following them, like you're just minding your business. And that you live here. You have to kind of like project that in some way.
Wow.
Yeah, so not necessarily scared, but just like making sure people know that they're safe. which is twisted to have to do, but yeah.
Yeah. So did you ever find yourself in moments where you felt you had to defend your Blackness or sort of not explain your blackness, but defend. When I say defend, like I mean like stand up to a misconception that somebody may have about your blackness to white people around you. Like, were you ever fetishized or watched Black people in the community be fetishized or like sort of like looked at as a science experiment, or was it really one of these things where it was like, yo, people didn't really ask those sorts of things?
Yeah, no, I didn't have to go through anything like that. It's definitely has been more of just like microaggressions because people not Black felt comfortable with me. I was the Black friend. I was the Black acquaintance. I was the ratio within this person that they felt like, oh, they're diverse because they have a Black person in their life, like they have a Jessica in their life. So obviously they're not, they're inclusive to every type of person, but it's kind of different when you have someone who does code switch to make you feel comfortable to be around me, right? Like to make sure for you to even have like a conversation with me and feel like you can say like, oh, it's okay, like I have a Black friend or I know a Black person, or I can figure out more about the Black community from this person. For you to all of a sudden, for you to, well, not all of a sudden, for you to feel comfortable, I have to do a lot of work on my end to make sure that you feel not to make sure, but I do a lot of work on my end so that you do feel comfortable to kind of ask those questions. But then that comes with just a lot of questions like about hair and about food and about, where my family comes from. Like, I have no idea. America.
So would you say that like in this time right now, in the middle of this like resurgence of heavy conversation around identity and Blackness and even things like reparations, right? And how this country has just completely fucked Black people, how have you seen your white community respond? Has their engagement around you changed? Is there a lot of white guilt that you're seeing and managing with folks? Or have you always been down with the woke white warriors who are just sitting here looking at everybody else crazy like, yep, y'all had it wrong all these years? Or are you doing some labor right now as a Black woman in a lot of white people's lives?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I'm doing right now is showing empathy and making sure that they are aware that there's work to be done in realizing about the history of this country, but understanding, especially if they're in that place where they have felt like they aren't privileged, or they all of a sudden have realized that they are privileged and trying to figure out what that is, and like kind of mortified that they weren't truly plugged into the history of America, in order to fight more sooner. Maybe like they feel like what they're doing right now is way too late, and that they're on the side of wanting to be an ally and wanting, true equality for all, but now they just feel like my eyes weren't opened wide enough sooner. They're mortified right now. Like they're really horrified. So those are a lot of the type of people that I talk to. And it's in order for me, I feel like in order to make sure that the work is still being done, that progress is still maintained, you have to give a sense of empathy, or they are going to start to do things that are huge, like huge gestures, and get worn out and overwhelmed super fast. So if you don't give that level of like empathy and understanding to their journey and their process of realizing that their eyes just really weren't opened as much as they needed to, then they're going to start trying to figure out like what they can do to make up for lost time. And when you're sprinting like that and pushing so hard and so fast, like, I gotta make it right, I gotta make it right, I gotta do my part, like you take on a lot and you get very overwhelmed. Like I just see like they look like deer in the headlights. They're just like, well, what can I do? I have to do this, I have to do that. It's like, yes, like those are all great things and those are all important things and that we do have to do. I'm not saying that we're not. I'm saying like, take something small, take something that you can do every single day that's going to continue to push that needle, that's going to continue to move the mark. Be kinder to yourself with understanding the history and the journey. Be kind to yourself when talking to someone else within the Black community, right? Be kinder to yourself within these moments so that you can really grasp, really understand, but also continue to do this for much longer. Like, this can no longer be a movement, which means at some point it's going to end. This is what we have to do on the daily, every single day. So that's been my biggest job when talking to people. It's just making sure that, like, yes, I know it's very overwhelming. I'm so sorry. You're just figuring this out now. But you know, I'm glad that you are welcome. Awesome. You're welcome here. Now take the time to really dig your feet in. Take this time to really understand, and take the time to find a purpose within it, right?
Mm.
Pick an area of where you want to focus and where you want real change to happen, and focus on that area. Understand it, learn about it first. Don't just throw time, money, and efforts and ideas at it. Take time to understand where it is first. Be kinder to yourself, slow down, and then kind of make those big gestures. So, you know, that's kind of what I've been doing.
Yeah.
Being kind.
I think that like there was a point where at the beginning of COVID when a lot of things were happening and you know shit was going down. I noticed that you had started watching like a lot of documentaries and kind of like making sure that like you were kind of educating yourself
Had to.
so that you can then put in the work at Google. Can you speak a little bit about your education, you educating yourself, what you were watching, and then how that's translated into what you're doing at Google?
Yeah, so I had to do that. I think we all had to, at some point. Again, like, I grew up in a Black family, but we didn't really talk about a lot of Black history other than just like what my parents went through growing up in the 40s and 50s and 60s, right? So, you know, go like talking about like the actual Detroit riots and how my dad was aware of that and a part of that, you know, talking about a lot of things that happened with civil rights in the South and how my mom, you know, was growing up through that. But it wasn't a lot of the history. We didn't truly know a lot that was happening, or know about it. You just, and, you know, school didn't really teach you that much either about, you know, the history of America. And I don't want to talk about, not necessarily the history of America, not necessarily just Black history, but history in general. So, you know, when things are coming up and you have to talk to a lot of people, you have to kind of do the background work and just refreshing yourself and reminding yourself of the things that happen. So I did a lot of that, of just watching documentaries. I also was just doing a lot of work within my work, right? A lot of seminars were coming up, a lot of discussions were coming up on a lot of different documentaries. So in order for me to do my job and make sure like the right things were in place, I needed to watch the documentaries to make sure that the sessions were actually going to run well. But on top of that, that's what we did a lot, especially after Ahmaud Arbery's murder. We did a lot of different discussions and initiatives and bringing up of documentaries to talk about that, to help people kind of learn more. We built, you know, some resource libraries so people could look at different types of music and podcasts and documentary movies and follow different type of activists so that they can learn more. Other resource libraries of where people could donate, organizations that they could follow to volunteer. So did a lot of work there, and just continuing to do work with like internally within departments on diversity and inclusion, and making sure that, you know, we're still doing what we can for people that work within our org too. That's also important work too. So it's still something that I'm doing on a daily basis. There's like another 2 initiatives that I'm working on within the next 2 weeks, actually, just to keep this going. So it's something that's very exciting. And again, I'm happy that, you know, my team puts so much time towards it. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you have the space to work on that. I feel like there are even, and I love that you talked about the education piece, because I feel like there's this assumption that being Black automatically means that you understand the full extent of the movement, you know, how we're here and all that jazz. And it's not true. And it's, and that the lack of truth in that is displayed even in the way in which people are experiencing this moment in time differently. Like, not every Black person is sitting here with the same opinion. I mean, hello, we have Black Trump supporters in the world, like, they exist, right? And so there is this way in which we have to dig into our histories and look at things for what they are, to really be able to unpack, well, what is the progress? What are we progressing from, right? Because one could argue with that, like, and this is not your story necessarily, but like, there are people who grow up in white communities, and it's so much so that, like, they're engulfed in the experience that they had there. And so now the larger history of Blackness in America starts to seem a little false or even exaggerated for some people, right? Where it's kind of like, well, I'm a Black person in America and I've been that my whole life, and half the things people are marching about do not apply to me. Like, that is just not, just not my life. I don't get it, right? And so it starts to create this false narrative that makes it seem like the Black community wants to include you in the movement, to drag you down and make you say that your experience is one thing when it's not, versus saying what the Black movement wants to do is have the diversity and voices, because it is not a monolith. And because there's so many layers, we can't let overarching, you know, systems of power pigeonhole us into the things that are buzzwords. Or, yeah, they'll cover certain things we're doing in the news, but they'll cover it in a very particular way. Like, we'll see, yes, Black Lives Matter movement stuff, but they won't show groups of entrepreneurs that are trying to build financial literacy institutions and circles for people of color so that they understand investments and stocks and all. Like, we don't see that on the news, but we'll see when people are fighting over things and then have arguments around gang violence and things that try to hold Black people accountable to their own experience. Like, it's just, there's so many malleable ways to present this argument. And so going back to source and facts and information about what happens, I think is super important, no matter where you ultimately land in the movie.
And it's so true. I mean, even if you are even if you are in that group that feel like, you know, the things that are being blasted across the media don't necessarily apply to you, and that doesn't come from your world. If you are working on some different type of initiative, right? It still comes from somewhere, because you are a Black person within history, right? Like, wherever you're having to push harder, wherever you're having to, you know, or even if it's not pushing harder, just like a focus, right? Like, that focus is coming from something that has happened within American history, within the Black community. So it is important to always just continue to educate yourself and remind yourself of some things. Like, I was watching a documentary for a discussion I was having like last month with my team, and there was like some archival clips from Georgia with John Lewis, and how he was leading a like a non-aggression like workshop, right? Like, how to not use force on another person if you're being attacked, right? Because they were about to go do a sit-in at lunch counters. They were about to, you know, freedom riders, they were about to ride on the bus. So they were doing workshops on how to not fight back and how to be peaceful when someone else may be attacking you and fighting at you. And I was like, watching this workshop and this archival video, and I was like, how have I never seen this? Like, how have I never seen something about this? Like, this is Georgia, this is American history, and I've never seen an archival clip like this before. Like, even if this is not something they felt like, you know, was necessarily appropriate within the school system, it definitely should have been something that was way more publicized, you know, before now, when I'm in like my, you know, my late 20s, just seeing such an important video like this now. So it's very frustrating, but it's good to be able to do this now, and, you know, to learn for myself, but also to help other people.
So my last question for you is sort of an idea, like, you know, like imagination, provocation is the word. if you had a choice, right, in for your upbringing or for your future upbringing of your maybe kids, would you intentionally choose to raise your child in a more Black community or a more white community given your experience? Is there anything that you feel that could be gained from reversing the experience you had, or is there something that you think was gained in the experience you did have that you would want to perpetuate forward?
Yeah. I mean, in all honesty, I don't think the big huge part of what I missed growing up was really necessarily to like where I grew up. It's more of just like the information I was exposed to. If I had more of an opportunity to, talk more with like with my not my siblings, talk more with my cousins, right? Like just about different things and maybe have that kind of open dialogue. I think a lot of it also, which is kind of how my family dynamic is too, but just kind of talk more about, openly about experiences and maybe still have those conversations today as we're still a family. I talked about the sacrifices of my parents, right? I feel like that's a huge thing when it comes to kind of understanding the culture and understanding those sacrifices. That means that and now my parents' values and my siblings' values are different because of that. I feel like if those conversations came up more about our family history, about the sacrifices in order to kind of have these privileges that we have now, that would be really huge and kind of figuring out a dynamic and being kind of more plugged into the history of my family and within the Black community itself. So I don't know. I don't think it would necessarily be a location thing, more of just a lot more exposure to the history and the community of the family, I think is kind of the biggest thing and kind of where I feel like I missed a lot growing up.
Amazing. So happy to hear that because sometimes there are people, and in Spanish there's the phrase mejorando la raza, which means improving the race, right? Which is always associated with this idea of like marrying white or including whiteness in the experience to better the experience. And so, it wasn't a trick question, but you just never know. Some people walk away and they believe what they believe, and it's just the truth of their experience. So I was curious about that. So thank you. And thank you so much.
I don't necessarily think you have to you know clean the bloodline. I think in order to have a better life, I think that's crazy. I will personally say that because I did grow up in a white community, when it comes to just my interest in a mate, that I do date more white men. But that's just a preference. It's just honest. That is just a preference thing of kind of, yes, that is a preference thing of where I grew up, right? Like I am a nature of a creature of my environment. So as my little teen heart was growing up, it was a lot of white guys that caught my eye.
But would you say it's like it's a preference that's sought after, like intentionally, or just an option that's open so that you're like, oh, okay, yeah, like white dudes are welcome just as much as anyone else, or is it like a nah, white and maybe a Black guy? Like, are you into Black men? Or are you just like?
Yeah, I think when I was younger, it was definitely like intentional. It was like,
oh, same, which is why I'm asking. So just to be clear, that's also not a setup question.
When I was younger, it was definitely intentional. It was like I wanted to be with a white guy. But as you grow up, you realize that that's nonsense. You realize that that's ridiculousness, and you also realize more kind of outside of even a race, just kind of what your heart wants, right, from a person. So that can't come with any race, right? Because guys are going to be guys, people are going to be people no matter what. They could be, orange and still be crazy. That doesn't really mean anything. So I think as I grew up, it was more of just like the kind of personality I wanted to be connected with and the interest level that I wanted to be connected with and kind of have the kind of the same interests in that way. So, and then also, she really likes people who are attractive. So a lot of different races, with a lot of different attractive people. But I would say that ultimately my preference, or I do still lean towards white men when it comes to dating.
I totally hear. I was like that growing up too. Still have yet to really be. I've never had like sex with like a traditional white man. I say traditional because like I dated a Puerto Rican guy who was white passing depending on the day. So like yeah, but like I haven't like had a white Bob, Bob and Joe. I've not fucked Bob and Joe yet. So, what I thought was my preference has yet to become my reality. But that's really cool. Jessica, thank you so much for coming on today, sharing all these gems. Can you tell us where can we find you and follow you on the interwebs?
Oh yeah, I'm not huge into social media. She's definitely more of the behind the scenes kind of girl. But yeah, you can follow me on my Instagram, Soul Music 13.
Yes, Soul Music 13 and Skittles. Where can they find us?
And you guys can follow us at Ladies Who Brunch on Instagram, Ladies Brunch on Twitter, at Julissa on Instagram, and at The Real Skittles on Twitter.
Wonderful. And I'm sorry, the mucus was just like, yeah. And thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. And until next time, bronche.